It can be open discussion, but feel free to ask a question at any time. So what I was asked to discuss originally was the idea of the historical Jesus, with a view to people from the rationalist movements, the non-believers, have traditionally been thought to be people who believe that there wasn't any such person, the myth theory of Jesus it's called. I just don't buy the myth theory. It's working on a really interesting idea, but then they add 2 and 2 and get 5, and it's looking, the original insight of it is sound, but the conclusions that they then reach from it, I think, are unsound. So what are then sound ideas about Jesus? Most of the sources I'm going to use are Christian scholars. So I don't think there's any doubt that somebody called Jesus, although there's a caveat on that, existed. There seems no reason to doubt that. But, as when he was writing this, a Southern Baptist scholar, E.P. Sanders, wrote, Jesus became such an important man in world history that it's sometimes hard to believe how unimportant he was during his lifetime, especially outside Palestine. We tend to see him as a sort of an epoch-making, an epoch-changing figure, and must therefore have been of epochal significance in his day. But that's simply not the case. Christian scholars see this as much as anybody else. So what is it that we know about Jesus? What can we say that's reasonably sound knowledge? Again, I'm following Sanders here. So he was born 4 BCE. Might have been 6, probably 4. Childhood spent probably in Nazareth. Maybe baptized by John the Baptist. He brought disciples to him and around him, and he taught in towns, villages, and countryside of Galilee originally, not in the cities. So he remained a country prophet, and he preached something called the kingdom of God, which is a far more complicated idea than those few words would suggest. And about 30 of the Common Era, he went into Jerusalem. Now, why he did this is extraordinarily interesting. He went in at the time of Passover, where he went and caused trouble deliberately around the temple. He then, knowing that this would cause a degree of trouble, had a meal with his disciples. Then the plot started to go a bit wrong for him, because instead of the epoch-changing event that he thought was going to happen, the Romans just came in and arrested him and dispatched him as they dispatch any other petty troublemaker from the provinces. That's what happened. Some equally secure facts, according to Sanders, about what happened after his life. So the disciples fled. In their trauma, they thought about him. Some claimed they had seen him. And as a consequence, they believed that he would in fact return to found the kingdom. Because remember, his whole story had been about the kingdom of God, which at the moment, now he's dead, is not happening. So how do you reconcile the essential failure of his message? And you do that by having to rearrange what kingdom of God means. They then, as they waited for this kingdom of God to happen, formed a community, a reasonably tight-knit community, and built up a relationship within themselves, within the Jewish faith, which they were still a part of, and sat down to wait out the arrival of the kingdom. And they waited. And they waited. Okay, so there's the guts of it. Jim Veach teaches it, well, he now teaches terrorism, but he then taught religion. I'm not sure if that was an easy transition for him. But he talked about the main conclusion of current scholarship on Jesus was that talking about a non-Jewish Jesus is a non sequitur. Now, let's just have a little bit of history here. There have been three, what's known as quests for the historical Jesus. The first one, the name best associated with it is Albert Schweitzer. His book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, it came out a century ago this year. He summarized everything that the 19th century people had said. And Schweitzer said we can't really find a person. Every time we tend to write a book called The Life of Jesus, what are we doing? We're really just putting what we want into the book. And we're making Jesus, like, so the 19th century writers were making him a lovely humanitarian person with slightly romantic fringes to him. Because that's what a truly beautiful person would have looked at the time. So that's the first quest, which ended, as Schweitzer said, in this failure to be able to write a credible life of Jesus. The second quest for the historical Jesus happened after the Second World War in the 50s. Mainly philosophers, theologians, Rudolf Bultmann, people like that, and they were looking for an existential Jesus. So they would say, yes, 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 a lot of it's myth, we know that. So now, how do we make a Jesus out of the myth? How do we make a new Jesus where we reconcile this myth, this mythological account that is structured into every phrase of the New Testament and what we rudely call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and how do we make a credible Jesus figure out of that? Knowing that it's myth, enjoying the fact that it's myth. That was the second quest. What's been known as the third quest for the historical Jesus has been in the last 30 years or so. And that's been emphasizing the social and cultural roots, the milieu in which Jesus operated. So what they're saying is, okay, we can't build a person, a life of Jesus story. We're not comfortable by all this mythologizing going on. What can we find out about Jesus from the context of his life? The first fact of the context of his life is that he was a Jew, which is why Jim Veitch is saying that the idea of a non-Jewish Jesus is a non sequitur. Now here, of course, we come to the very point of his name. As I'm sure a lot of you know, his name, Jesus, is a Greek translation. His actual name is Yeshua, and he's a rabbi. So, we should really talk about Rabbi Yeshua. That's who we're talking about. The title is Rabbi. The title that the Christians later gave him was the Christ. And they translated his name into a Greek form of Jesus. But what that's doing is changing his name into one from a totally different culture, with a totally different set of presuppositions behind it, and they gave him a different title. So, all right, my name is Bill, I'm a doctor. So after I die, if I become Captain John, and they're talking about my marvellous life, can you see the sorts of problems that are going to happen as a result of this? And that's what we're talking about, even more serious than that, really. Okay, now, John Shelby Spong, liberal theologian, is saying the same thing when he says, indeed, one will never understand the Gospels, I'm now convinced, unless and until one can embrace their essential Jewishness. And this is what the third quest is about. This is what's happening now with respect to placing Jesus in his, or Yeshua as we should probably call him, in his cultural and religious context. Jesus harbored traditional thoughts about God and Israel, and did not envisage a religious system independent of Judaism. Absolutely crucial. Jesus is a Jew, so I've been hammering on this one, but he also had no intention of splitting away from Judaism. We find evidence for this in the New Testament, where he says in Matthew 5:17-18, do not suppose that I've come to annul the law, the first 5 books of what we rudely call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to complete them. For I assure you, while heaven and earth endure, not one iota or one projection of a letter will be dropped from the law until it's accomplished. Now, that's pretty clear cut. He's not here to mess around with the law, as Paul later claimed. He's not here to tittle-tattle and change and adjust. He's here to bring to fruition every jot and tittle of the law, the Jewish law. And he had a particular plan as to how that would go about. We'll get on to that. The part of his plan was he was an apocalypticist who expected a cataclysmic intervention of God into history and was devastatingly wrong. Effectively, his wrong is important, obviously. So, when he's talking about the kingdom of God, it's the apocalypse that's significant. Because remember, what's the Jewish context of the time? The Jewish land is occupied by Rome, having before been occupied by Seleucids, one of the Greek successor states from Alexander, and having before that been occupied by Alexander, before that by the Babylonians, before that by the Persians, the Medes, all sorts. All right? And yet, when you go through reading the Hebrew Bible, what are you finding? You're finding the covenant. I think it's in 2 Samuel 7:22, where God says to David, "Your line will last forever." But it hasn't, because there's no Jewish kingdom anymore. It didn't last forever. It got destroyed by all these people coming in, foreigners coming in, desecrating the temple and doing these outrages. So the idea of Zion, which was originally a physical location, it was God's postal address. The temple on the hill in Jerusalem was where God lived. That was his physical postal address. That gets kicked upstairs and becomes a projection into the future. So when we're looking at the kingdom of God, what the Jews brilliantly were trying to do was say, okay, look, we just can't guarantee this turf, this bit of land anymore. Let's try and kick it upstairs and render it safe there, and then we can project to it so that we're looking for the kingdom. And what we're looking for then is the Messiah, who will, once it's properly safe back on ground, bring the kingdom back. Now, Rabbi Yeshua was just one of many prophets. There was nothing new or different radically about what he was doing. He was one of the many prophets claiming to be this Messiah, who said, yes, I've got the formula by which Zion, which was once a hill, a physical location, and got kicked up into the ether in order to protect it in the Jewish memory from the ghastly and dreary reality on the ground of foreign occupation. I'm the one who can bring this back, because I understand the message of the law and the message of the prophets. And so what Rabbi Yeshua was doing with his reading of some of the later minor prophets, Zechariah in particular, was going in to, if you like, force God's hand. Because when you go home, read Zechariah, fascinating little book. Read Zechariah, look at the prophets, look at the prophecies, and what Rabbi Yeshua, an uncomplicated man of Galilee, said, what we need to bring the kingdom of God at hand is these prophecies to live out. I am the one who will do this.